Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 1, Chapter 1. Her body was not her own as she slid down the canted rock face, the back of her head already littered with abrasions and lacerations too numerous to count. It took everything she could muster to ride gravity between broken stone pillars, calved sections of carved statuary, and innumerable jagged rocks. The dust and scree that carpeted everything in the blasted cavern surrounding her made even the slightest movements deadly as she scrambled to place a foot here or a hand there. Echoing reports bombarded her mind trail from all directions, confirmations that sent chills up her aching spine as each stone loosened in the chaos found the ground below, a reminder of her fate should she lose any more of her dwindling focus. She thought her mind was ablaze with the art of staying alive, a welcome diversion from the emotions that, themselves, threatened to tear her apart. With a deft roll to her left, Ahsoka Tano managed to get her foot in place to enable the leap she envisioned to an adjacent slab of debris-littered stone. She hesitated suddenly, a wave of remorse tugging at her mind forming questions she did not want to face at the moment, or ever if she was honest about it. Just let go, the thought proclaimed, her mind finding 1,000 rebuttals in a fraction of a second. Just end the pain. The thought responded in turn, causing her stomach to lurch at the prospect as she pushed herself off her stone slide with a grunted effort and landed a few short seconds later on the adjacent slab, angled in the opposite direction, although not as steep. However, her general direction was irrevocably downward, despite her effort to slow the descent. Ahsoka saw her next leap looming as the thoughts returned. There is no hope. She grappled with the sincerity the thought elicited before rejecting it outright and doing what she could to tune out the detrimental proposal. She regained her focus in time to leap from her right foot, this time onto a wedged stone beam that was relatively flat, landing on her stomach with an air-depleting oomph. Ahsoka saw stars for a moment as she lay there, her face planted into the stone's cool surface as her lungs contracted with painful results. Her chest felt aflame from the pressure as she pushed herself up on her hands and knees, her head spinning with the encroaching dizziness of oxygen deprivation. She felt the emotion she had been able to drown, rising to be reckoned with as a hint of air made its way into her mouth, her lungs flaring wide in greed. The pain was enough to stamp the emotions back down into afterthought, as her chest felt like it was tearing itself apart from the additional thrumming of her heart slamming into her ribs. On the threshold of losing consciousness, she managed a simple exhale, displacing what dust was left on the stone that her face had not picked up. It was enough to satisfy her instinct for base survival, as she felt her aching muscles relax from their exhaustive efforts and her face reacquaint itself with the stone below. The thoughts returned. Without the distraction of saving her own life, Ahsoka was now at their mercy. With them came the emotions, unchecked, unbridled, and furious for attention. Let it all go, Ahsoka. The thought spoke as one, echoing within every recess of her racing mind. Images joined the words that reigned in her conscious absence. Images of lightsabers crossing each other, sparking discharge, firing off the red and white blades in all directions. Her mind played the scene for itself repeatedly, all from different perspectives. She saw herself, her orange pigmentation, a fiery version of itself in the glowing crimson of his saber. His helmet, a vision of star fields for every angle reflecting the white of hers. Her mind reviewed the temple's surroundings, burning its fiery red as it closed them off from any hope of ending the duel in arcing red lines, pulsing with an existence of their own as the temple walls came to life around her. He did not seem fazed nor distracted through the chaos as he struck high and low with his furious resolve. Her sabers met each attempt to end her life in stride, blocking, diverting, parrying. He had no opening with which to keep his promise. He had trained her well. The images began to fade, to blur into themselves as the thoughts returned to convince her mind that life was hopeless. Let it all go, Ahsoka. They coalesced again into an echoing epithet that even her mind refused to acknowledge. Emotion threatened to throttle her back into consciousness as her mind shot them back into an afterthought, its efforts in dire need of reinforcement as it began to waver in its resolution. You've earned the easy path, Ahsoka. Just let it all go. The thought was distinct as it worked its way around her mind's defenses, hinting at what her life had garnered. Ahsoka's mind knew it was failing as the synapses fired wildly to awaken her. Small victory came from a slight tremor in Ahsoka's index finger, and her mind thrust forward with a renewed sense of urgency. More synapses firing faster and more intensely registered a shaking wrist and a dancing ankle. More. Her mind pushed every connected web in her brain toward a single goal as it fired everything it could. With a throaty groan, Ahsoka breathed in sharply and blinked her eyes several times, motes of dust descending out of eyesight as a single pebble pinged its way downward. Wake up! Her mind took the opportunity and ran with it, its last remote hope to save itself from the aggressive thoughts and encroaching emotions, as she groaned again and opened her eyes fully. It's not what you say to the council, Snips, it's how you say it. What? Ahsoka said, picking her aching head off the cold, hard stone and throwing it around in wild arcs to find the speaker to no avail. The darkness only stared back in return, the echo of her question asking numerous times before it dissipated into silence. She knew it could not have been confirmed, even as she felt the hot winds and stinging red sands of Geonosis on her skin. What the? She trailed off the question as she looked down to inspect her arms, only to find the ravaged and bleeding flesh peppered with layers of dust and drying blood. Because it's only after we neutralize the guns that we can push for the factory. Ahsoka rocked her head in all directions, steadying herself with both hands before her as the resulting dizziness threatened to topple her over the side. With a firm left-handed grip on the stone's edge, she brought her right up to press against her temple, pushing her thumb hard to stabilize her swaying vision. Who's there? She asked, again greeted by her echo. Trailing streams of dust, forced loose by the changes in pitch caused by her frantic actions, cascaded down to the ground below in response. Ahsoka peered over the side to gauge the distance, to no avail, as the darkness withheld its secrets from her. What is happening? She could only ask herself as her skin began feeling cold, an icy embrace she knew had nothing to do with the temperature. You've already made your decision, haven't you? This meeting is just a formality. His words were shouted now as they had been then, though for her alone. She closed her eyes and let them echo through her mind, remembering the look on his face as he cast protocol under his boot heel in front of the Jedi Tribunal, the determination of faith in his eyes as his rage brewed behind them, his trembling jawline and quivering lip as he did his best to subdue the roiling contempt within him. You can't do this, Anakin shouted in defiance of the Jedi Master's judgment. His voice echoed off the chamber walls as she heard them echo in her mind. Ahsoka clamped her eyes shut tight as memory mingled with thought and emotion, a feeling of dread taking hold of her senses as she tried focusing on the imagery that flickered in and out of view. Austere walls pocketed with lines of illumination. Senators lined up in rows at various levels as she was set in manacles before the accusatory diatribe of Chancellor Sheev Palpatine. Charges of sedition and treason reverberated in and through her mind. Where were you, Anakin? She mumbled in the present, a cold whisper that equated to the memory she had suppressed for so long. She could feel the penetrating gaze of Admiral Tarkin bore through her as he continued to finger blame and accuse her of further sedition. Tarkin. The memory caused her to shudder involuntarily. I am here with evidence and a confession from the person responsible for all the crimes Ahsoka has been accused of. You didn't abandon me, did you, Master? Ahsoka said in a hushed tone, her eyes still squeezed shut in deep reflection. The hopelessness her thoughts had insisted on convincing her of earlier, renewing their assault. You abandoned him, Ahsoka. The thought caused her to catch her breath with a sharp inhale as her mind raced in memory to the council chambers atop the Jedi Temple. She squeezed her eyes shut with such ferocity that her head began to spin again, trying to bypass the image, to bypass the moment she made her decision. Despite her efforts, she closed Anakin's hand around the silka beads and swallows her sorrow again, eliciting a whimper from deep within. The look in his eyes when he realized what had transpired. Why are you doing this? The council didn't trust me, she mouthed the response in her quiet lament, suspended above a dark unknown. What about me? I believed in you. I stood by you. Don't say it, you fool, she forced her mind to say, knowing what was coming. This isn't about you, she whispered again to the ruins surrounding her. I need to sort this out on my own, Ahsoka said with more authority, opening her eyes to the darkness beyond. Without the council, and without you, she finished, rising to her feet, the suppressed emotion beginning to win the war of attrition with her soul. The dam she had erected around the anger she had been suppressing threatened to eviscerate itself into oblivion as she felt the fires of rage boil within her. No, she whispered to the stone in darkness. No, she said aloud to the rain and scree and dust as it danced in the air before her. No, she grumbled through her clenching teeth to the Semple's remains around her, seething the words with her increasing anger. No, she yelled to the cavernous chamber, splintering rocks and debris, fragmenting various portions of the remainder of the ceiling above. No, she shouted to the temple ruins in Malachor itself. No, she screamed to the galaxy, the Empire, and beyond. I will not own your failure, Anakin. I will not own your fall, she said, spittle forming at the corners of her mouth as she seethed the words into existence. I will not own what you have become, Vader. The truth she and many others had assumed, made whole through her perspective and confirmed through her action, removed the strength from her knees as she fell forward onto the flat, cold stone, only placing her hands out to break her fall at the last second. The force of suppressed emotions threatened to break free from the final tether she had forcibly wrapped around them as she stared at the dark striations within the stone slab. Heavy breaths, exhaling swirling eddies of what dust was left undisturbed out and over the edge of the rock. She could feel herself burning from within, a tumult of unfettered aggression focusing with reckless intent through emotionally blurred eyes. That same emotion took many forms as she pushed herself up again, squaring her feet to stand. Ahsoka Tano released the finite tendrils of her control and stood waiting for anger, rage, and hate to take control. She snapped her hands down to retrieve her saber hilts and violently ignited them with a guttural scream of raw aggression. The internal struggle to direct the enormity of her motion into workable tangibility materialized itself into genuine hatred. Her eyes, she knew, reflected that resolve as she felt her brow furrow, intensifying her ferocity. The flood of raw negativity, the explosion of festering grief and sorrow, anger and resentment, made itself manifest in her thoughts and actions as she gripped her lightsabers with unusual vehemence, the tendons and ligaments in her hands and arms turning into thick ropes of durasteel cable. Ahsoka let loose a feverish dirge as frustration, shame, and guilt worked their way into the fold, the echoes of which sounding like a charging dewback as more pings of moving and cracking stone added their reports to the angry electronic ripple of the saber's blades. She arced the weapons in tight circles before her, building momentum as she sent rockets of her emotion into the act, feeding the rage they represented in her grip. She ripped her blades through the apex of one of the twin spires her flat stone came to rest upon, then returned the action. Repeatedly, she laced the white blades through the unforgiving stone, carving deep gouges and furrows into its surface, dripping red-hot slag from the angry wounds. Her fury would not be satiated as she dove deeper into the stone, turning the slagging drip into an unyielding flow, like blood from a mortal wound that could not be staunched. She did not relent. The sabers moved almost blindingly, striking the stone at every angle. The white light radiated in eccentric lines and circles, reflecting off the tears of both sorrow and anger running down her cheeks. Her eyes bore the outward sign of the hate-taking form. Fierce, narrowing hatred took up residence in the place of the cascading tears. Hate for being naive, hate for her cowardice, hate for her weakness, hate of her past, pure, unrefined, imperfect, and raw. Ahsoka could feel the hate turning to rage as the thoughts refined the emotion into weapons of choice, sharp and perfect in their deadly precision. She felt the betrayal welling deep within her, manifesting itself through her fury, eradicating reason and rationality to absolute exhaustion. Ahsoka was panting, entirely out of breath, every muscle sore from the tirade as she dropped the sabers from her grip, the metal hilts clanging resolutely to the stone at her feet as the white-hot light pulled itself back into the emitter with a pitched whine. The emotions lay there, waiting for her to address them in turn, each one vying for her immediate attention as she dropped to her knees once again, the muscles giving way to gravity as her bones vibrated with an impact she did not acknowledge. Tears flooded her vision again, flowing from her the way the molten stone had from the carving execution of her saber's blades. Ahsoka knew she was becoming hopelessly unbalanced. She could hear Obi-Wan through the fog her mind had become. Let go of your emotion, Ahsoka, or it will guide you down a path no one can follow. No, she said aloud. There would have been one that followed, she whispered to the mind-conjured Jedi Master. Her tears renewed their descent as her hatred simmered away to a deeply rooted sorrow. No, she whispered again. I will not own this. She could feel the waves of negativity pulling at her with their own renewed vigor. She felt resentment and blame for her path being undeservedly thrust toward innumerable individuals. Yet she knew she was the only one responsible for her choices. Why, Anakin? The thought was constant since his bleeding use of her name. All you had to do was come with me to Mandalore, Anakin. She pleaded her case to the universe once again. The feelings of betrayal and abandonment refreshed as a rush of anger and pain began to seep their tendrils into the chaotic disorder of her rationality. The cascading effect of emotions trading places with one another continued to lead her down the path of despair she was battling against and losing. She felt herself becoming the epitome of the descendant path the Jedi had warned against for eons as guilt and shame gripped her very soul. She felt as though the universe were laughing at her, mocking her pledges of ownership, and forcing her to accept her responsibility for guilt and shame. Her mind serviced her thoughts, revealing that she had turned her back on him on multiple occasions, not just once. It doesn't matter how many times, she said in answer, pitching feverishly back and forth on her knees, congealing what little sanity she had left as she felt herself losing this battle of attrition. She let the final tears of guilt and shame snake their way down her cheeks as she prepared herself for the waves of grief, sorrow, and despair to replace them. Her mind painted a perfect picture of what could have been. She could imagine a life not held in secret, where she could adopt her moral codes to her path as Jedi. She envisioned Anakin and Padme in an open declaration, their children at their sides, a life she would actively be a part of. She knew it was pointless, fruitless to think on such matters, but she also understood the need to let each passing emotion have its place in her thoughts if she was to be free of their burden, or of attrition be damned. Have your say, then leave me, she whispered to the still darkness, doing her best to heed the imagined advice of Master Kenobi. Knowing what could have been led her heart to the avenues of loss and frustration, not for what life she could have been a part of, but for Anakin himself. His presence now was a shadow of the man he had been, despite all the armor, gadgetry, and displays of dark dominance. It doesn't matter what you project, Anakin, for you are truly dead, she thought through the truth, leading to the pain and suffering she had long feared to confront. Ahsoka bowed her head low to the ground as she pounded a fist into the stone, knowing she could have done more. She could have insisted he come to Mandalore. She could have taken the Silka beads and found a path for them both. But she could have bowed to his will here on Malachor. Yet she did not. She chose her path, one that diverged from his long ago, where she had spent years protecting those who she could from the Empire's grip and policies. Following her code meticulously, he had extinguished himself truly and given everything implicitly to the Force in some distorted perspective she could not understand. With that final revelation, she felt the weight of anxiety lift from her shoulders, take up residence in the air itself and waft away from her being into the darkness beyond. You've chosen your path, Anakin. Now I choose mine, Ahsoka said with a decisiveness that eliminated the impression of the eternal battle that had waged for far too long. Ahsoka felt some relief from the victory, but knew it was only a battle in a wider-ranging war that never seemed to cease. Thoughts of Anakin, of Vader, brought the confirmation she had always involuntarily sought. Confirmations of the seeds of suspected corruption that stemmed from the true enemies of freedom and peace. Palpatine was a force the galaxy was unprepared for, even as Supreme Chancellor. Exacting the role of Galactic Emperor upon himself should have been the wake-up call everyone needed to play the hands their suspicion had delivered. Yet they did not, as she had not. She knew her perspective was a matter of timeliness as she looked around at the temple's ruins yet again, knowing that whom she faced and subsequently ran from with Ezra was precisely the man she knew him to be. Her thoughts revisited the numerous encounters with variations of the man over the years as she absently grabbed for her right elbow, aware only now of the pain that subsided within it. Her immediate past cast itself into focus as she could once again feel the searing heat of the blue flame touching her skin, penetrate the bone beneath, and threaten to consume her entirely. She patted at the extremity to satiate her need for clarity as she lifted it to her eyes for inspection. She found a harsh and severe-looking bruise in the increasingly orange light that began filtering in from the ruined ceiling above. Small bumps of irritation lingered, but not the acute pain she had expected, and she let the elbow drop back down to her side. The act brought her promise to Ezra into focus as it did the only thing they could to stem the tide of the Sith's flame, intent on destroying them. Ahsoka's thoughts, then, turned to Ezra, and the very promise itself she had made him as her parting words. As grief, shame, and guilt had serviced their respective agendas within her thoughts, so had sorrow and despair. Loss, pain, and suffering, being concordant with the cycles of nature, would never truly leave her. Still, grief and frustration would only lead her down avenues perpendicular to the promise she had made him. Ahsoka finalized her self-analysis with a proper eye toward her surroundings, as the commitment to Ezra brought with it the return to reality from which she could operate. She knew she had not faced her anger or rage, but thought better of addressing them any further, as that reality presented itself as fact. Malachor. At some point, Ahsoka would have to determine the workings of Ezra's actions, how he could inconceivably place himself in that duel she had forcibly removed him from. He had changed, she remembered. Something about losing Kanan? His answers to the numerous questions she had asked were indistinguishable from the haste with which they were uttered. He was anxious, naive, and well on his way to undoing everything Kanan had sacrificed himself for. She understood the moment, she could freely admit now, only because she had not acted out of emotion and knew her promise would be kept simply because he needed her to keep it. As the light from above grew brighter, so did her surroundings. The devastation was deceiving in its scope, as the light could not fully penetrate the ever-present haze of dust. Tiny crystalline particles within the air shimmered a refracted version of the light coming in from above. A rain that will never fall, she thought, with a curious eye into the unmoving prism under her scrutiny. Her memory triggered the last few seconds of her duel with Vader into conscious thought. Her decision to intersect both of her fates into a known entity. She would die, but not without destroying Vader in the process. Looking at the ruins, she could understand what had happened, but not how. As she was alive, through an intervention she could not even begin to describe, so too was Vader. The ruins would suggest otherwise, but she was certain their fates would intersect again, thus forcing the truth of his survival into her consciousness. What remained of the temple around her was inconsequential, the more she thought it through. It only stood as a reminder of her efforts, a reminder of what was, and a calling to follow through with her intended promise. She raised her head to the vacancy above her, Malachor's sun filling the space with a contrasting warm, soft glow as a whisper manifested in the stale, dusty air around her. It was indecipherable, nothing remotely reminiscent of the voices her mind had conjured, as it drifted lazily through her hearing and out again. Her mantra, unable to determine source or direction, she only looked about slowly, relying on her sight to decipher what her hearing could not. She waited patiently for an echo that never came. "Hello?" she asked softly, not entirely sure she anticipated an answer. Her query returned an echo the whisper had not, which raised reason for pause. She blew out her breath in exasperation as her patience was wearing thin. "Commander Tano, always on duty," she mumbled to herself, thinking of Rex in the process. She could feel the internal shift as she adopted the military mindset that had kept her alive, and the friendly face of the man who had helped mold her into such an instrument. Assess, locate, analyze, identify, cover. She recited the captain's creed aloud to calm her fraying nerves. Assessing the situation, she knew answers to her questions would not reside in her present location. Locating a way out of the ruins would test her mettle, but it was the only course of action she thought through the remaining three objectives. Ahsoka closed herself from further distractions, rising from her knees and grounding her footing into the flatness of the stone at her feet. Closing her eyes, she reached out through the force for any sign of a way out, anyone that may have been responsible for the whispers, and to return her core to the internal peace she sought. There was no one else here. Ahsoka opened her eyes to the truth of her predicament, but no clear direction was established to solve it. She looked down to her left wrist, unfastening the broken wristcom secured around it, and pitched it over the side of the stone slab. She would have to figure out how to get out alone. Looking up, she saw columns illuminated near the ceiling that spanned the distance to the floor below. Knowing she could jump between them in an effective evacuation, but felt absently for the contusions on her elbow, and knew she would not get halfway without failing the attempt and plummeting to an assured death. She closed her eyes again to call upon the Force, willing it to guide the broken stone that lay in all directions to form a natural path upward, but could only gasp in response as the Force itself hesitated, ebbing its flows away from her instead of in. Something natural, for as long as she had memories, was now a thing that could not be relied upon. She closed her eyes again with determined focus, concentrating on the stone slab beneath her feet. She could feel it vibrate and shudder from her efforts, but nothing more. A loud crack, echoing its resonation into the bowels of the chamber and beyond, stopped her immediately as she looked down to see a meandering split trace of a chaotic line perpendicular to the stone's edge. Gravity would only keep her in place for a few more minutes, she assessed, while her mind besieged answers she could not fathom. She was missing something and had little time to determine what it was. In the confluences of thought, the registering coincidence of thinking and perception regarding betrayal, she began to understand the struggle itself in its present form. The equation she needed to solve was missing the context from which her solution could only be derived, and the knowledge almost made her head spin. She was out of her element within the temple, and although the Force had responded when called upon earlier, she realized it had only done so to satiate a query, not enact an escape. She knew the light, which she routinely called upon, was itself being deceived by the one thing this temple, this planet, was rife with. She would need to utilize its counterpart, but had little to no knowledge of how to do so. Very few of her mentors in the past would entertain her questions regarding such matters, and those who would venture into philosophical applications or outright conjecture, providing her with little of use now. The registry of nascent emotion threatened to return her to her earlier predicaments as the scope of what she needed to do mirrored the very thing she knew her master had fallen victim to. Of course, she alighted the air before her with objective sarcasm. A genuine fear gripped her suddenly as that reality became ever more pressing. She would have to utilize the dark side of the Force and tap into the energies the temple itself was a conduit for, without letting it consume her soul. For only a moment, she acknowledged the fear, understood its wisdom, and quickly let it go. Ahsoka knew there was no other way. If she clung to the fear, she knew she would be consumed by it and the power she hoped to channel. She knew she did not need to be Sith to call upon the dark side. She need only embrace the feral and natural energies of the place long enough to stem the tide of resisting energies she was used to calling upon. She knew enough of the dark side to understand what she had to do and quickly let her emotions rush in again. They came fast and furious, but she did not wear them, only to acknowledge them in concert with her efforts as tools to accomplish a task. She focused on sorrow, pain, and hatred, specifically, willing them into a usable form. She closed her eyes tight in concentration as she willed that form into steps hewn from the broken stone around her so she could climb her way out. She slowly raised her hands before her, feeling the manifestation of power sufficient for the undertaking. The effort was quickly exhausting her, yet she refused denial. She cracked an eye open, hoping for the results, but only seeing failure. Ahsoka's arms trembled from the strain of her exertion, her head throbbing from the intensity with nothing to show. She could hear the splitting of stone and the raining of dirt, dust, and pebbles all about her, but the rock she sought to utilize remained unmoving. She dug her feet in place and gave her attempt one last momentous exertion of the last of her remaining energy as she focused solely on her anger. She could feel a vibrational hum from every stone structure around her, rattling her mantra in a tumultuous cacophony of mind-scrambling tones. She could see the opening far above rip in upon itself and send metric tons of debris crashing to the floor far below, the piercing sun blinding her for a second as she exhaled her aggression through closed teeth in a shout that defined her intent. A tremor in the very stone she stood upon caused her to cease the endeavor, lest she fall anyway in the attempt. She collapsed onto her knees yet again, as the strain of the efforts had tapped her very core of its life-giving energies. Panting, she looked around and could only marvel at the new level of destruction she had enacted. Eddies of pluming smoke from innumerable heat sources she had created from ripping stone from stone cast the dust and crystalline particles into a chaotic frenzy of motion that danced in the sun's orange light. She blew out her breath slowly, trying to correct her breathing as her mind focused on the unprecedented resistance to what she was succumbing to. "Fine predicament, Tano," she mumbled to herself. There was no direct instructor for what she knew she had to do. The power to remove herself from this place was within her. She only had to do what she refused to do moments ago before. Light side energies came to her naturally, and this place resisted its use from every angle. She had to become unnatural to herself and block the very thing she was attempting to use. She had no idea how to shelve her morals and integrity, even for a moment, but it was the only way. She sat in her meditative pose, rested her hands on her knees, and slowly, very slowly, closed her eyes. It was then that she reached out, not to draw the force to her, but to feel it. She could touch both sides, but also in between. Dark, light, equity of both. The light side spoke to her as always, a rhythmic heating that had guided her since birth. That unnamed presence of equity acknowledged her presence but did little to greet her. The dark side, however, was moving in to embrace her. She broke off the connection, although hesitantly, to meditate solely on its meaning and how to translate it into something tangible. It surprised her how warm it had felt, how inviting it seemed, and how surprising it was to not be frightened by it. Ahsoka focused again on the dark, and it returned to her, not in a rush, but as an intimate friend. She held it there, in check, inspecting herself, inspecting it. What seemed unnatural moments before seemed like a thing forgotten, a thing that was once a passion. Despite her internal cautions about investigating this further, she knew she had no choice. She slowly drew her right hand up off her knee, as if in anticipation of receiving. She watched herself first touch and then hold that energy as it greeted her fully. The pain in her arm was instantly gone, and upon realizing that, she took that energy in the palm of her hand and drew it forward to her chest. The energy hesitated before her. It needed to be invited in. It seemed that she had one last decision to make.